9 experienced hikers suddenly cut their way out of their own tent and disappeared into the freezing night without their coats or boots, and when rescuers finally found them, the condition of some of their bodies turned an already terrifying mystery into something no one could explain. This story involves unexplained deaths, disturbing injuries, and real photographs of the victim and recovery scene. Viewer discretion is advised. And this is one of those mysteries where every time you think you've found an explanation, another detail comes along and makes you question the whole thing again. Because whatever happened on this mountain had to be so frightening enough to convince 9 experienced hikers that running outside into brutally cold temperatures without properly dressing and no shoes was somehow safer than staying inside their tent. So we're going back to January of 1959 in the Soviet Union, where a group of 10 young hikers set out on a winter expedition through the Ural Mountains. Now, these weren't beginners who decided one weekend that hiking through Siberian winter sounded fun. They were experienced, prepared, and knew exactly how dangerous these conditions could and would be. They had skis, food, heavy winter clothing, cameras, journals, and equipment. All the equipment that they needed to survive out there. So there was no obvious reason to think that this trip would become anything other than another challenging adventure. Before they reached the most difficult part of the journey, one member of the group became sick and had to turn back. I bet when he's thought back in the future, he was pretty thankful he got sick. I imagine at the time he was probably really disappointed. But imagine training for something like this and then having to leave your friends behind because you're not feeling well. But that decision would end up saving his life, because the other 9 continued toward an area near a mountain that they called Dead Mountain, which is already a little unsettling considering what was about to happen there. So the hikers were expected to send word once they'd completed the difficult portion of their journey, but the expected date came and went without any message. Initially, nobody panicked because delays happen on winter expeditions, especially in weather like they were having. So eventually, though, enough time had passed that their families knew something wasn't right, and search teams were sent into the mountains to find them. Now, when searchers finally located their campsite, they found the tent partially covered in snow, and almost immediately, something didn't make sense. Their belongings were still there. Their food was there. Their cameras were there. Their money was there. And most importantly, their heavy winter clothing and boots were still inside the tent. Now, if these hikers had simply decided to leave camp, why would experienced people walk into dangerously cold temperatures dressed as if they were stepping outside for a few seconds? Or at all, right? Then the investigators looked at the tent itself and discovered something even stranger. It had been cut open from the inside. Apparently, whatever was happening that night made them feel they couldn't even take the time to use the normal entrance. They had sliced through the fabric and gotten out as quickly as they could, leaving behind the very things they needed to survive. So, outside the tent, searchers found footprints leading down the mountain toward the forest. Some appeared to have been made by people wearing socks, some by bare feet, and others, only one person was wearing a single shoe. Creepy. What's really strange is that the tracks suggested that the group had moved downhill together rather than scattering in every direction, so this doesn't look like 9 people are randomly panicking and running wherever they could. Something caused them to leave together, and apparently they believed getting away from that tent was more important than protecting themselves from the cold. Nearly a mile away, searchers reached a large cedar tree, and they found the first 2 members of the group. They were barely dressed despite the freezing temperatures, and there were remains of a small fire. So that tells us they had at least tried to keep themselves warm. The branches of the cedar had also been damaged high above the ground, suggesting someone may have climbed the tree, possibly trying to see the campsite or whatever they believed was happening back up the mountain. As rescuers searched between the cedar and the tent, they found 3 more members of the group. Their positions made investigators believe they may have been trying to return to the campsite when they collapsed. And honestly, that makes the whole thing even stranger to me, because at some point they apparently realized they desperately needed the clothing and supplies they'd abandoned, yet whatever had frightened them initially had been powerful enough to make experienced hikers leave all of it behind. 4 people were still missing, and they wouldn't be found until months later when the snow began to melt. Their bodies were discovered buried deep beneath the snow in a ravine. And this is where the case went from confusing to genuinely disturbing. Some had suffered devastating internal injuries, including severe skull and chest fractures that investigators compared to injuries caused by enormous force. Yet there weren't any of the obvious external wounds you might expect from injuries that serious. One of the women, Ludmila, was missing her tongue and some of the soft tissue from her face. That detail has fueled some of the darkest theories about this case. Although decomposition and exposure to the environment may explain at least some of those injuries, then investigators discovered more. Some of the clothing contained elevated levels of radiation. And suddenly people were just asking whether there had been an avalanche. There's all these theories going around. They were asking whether something much stranger had happened on that mountain. The original Soviet investigation eventually concluded that the hikers had died because of what officers or officials described as a compelling natural force. Now, I don't know about you, but that explanation almost creates more questions than it does answers. What natural force makes 9 experienced people cut their way out of a tent, walk half naked into deadly cold without boots on, and how do you connect that decision with the unusual injuries discovered later on their bodies? Over the decades, people have suggested just about everything you can imagine. There have been theories involving secret Soviet military tests, unusual weapons, infrasound, avalanches, wild animals, and even things far outside conventional explanations. More recent scientific investigations have argued that a particular type of slab avalanche could explain why the group suddenly evacuated the tent, and possibly even some of the injuries. And that explanation is certainly more grounded than most of the theories surrounding the case. But here's why people are still fascinated by Dyatlov Pass more than 60 years later. Even if an avalanche explains why they left the tent, you still have to reconstruct everything that happened afterward. Why'd they travel so far downhill? Why were some apparently trying to return? What exactly happened to the 4 people in the ravine? And most importantly, what did those 9 people experience in those final hours that made abandoning their only shelter seem like the best chance they had to survive? We may eventually explain every strange detail scientifically, and maybe the answer really is a tragic combination of an avalanche, darkness, extreme weather, injuries, and hypothermia. But standing inside that tent on that freezing night, those 9 people didn't know how their story would eventually be analyzed. They only knew something was happening that made them believe they needed to get out immediately. And whatever they thought was waiting outside seemed safer than staying where they were. That's the part that gets me. Somewhere on that mountain, something happened that changed an ordinary expedition into a desperate fight for survival. And every person who knew exactly what frightened them died before they could tell anyone what it was. Until next time, remember that every ordinary person has an extraordinary story. I'm Amber Joy, and I'll see you in the next story.